Hey, everybody. We want to make sure that you know about 2 2-hour sessions coming out soon from our friends at 5 Things I've Learned. Brooke and I have both taught there individually and together. And both of these classes are rare opportunities to learn directly from two great writers about what their own experiences have taught them about memoir writing and about artfully blending fact and fiction. And so here is the first author, memoirist, on Sunday, June 7th, that's coming up soon, best-selling author, essayist, public speaker, lyricist, and libretto writer Adam Gopnik shares the 5 things he's learned about the mysterious alchemy of rules, practices, and inner secrets that memoir writers can best apply to their own work. And then the following Sunday, June 14th, celebrated novelist, essayist, short story writer, and professor Peter Orner shares the 5 things he's learned about the ways that great writers bind fact and invention to create something new, the fictions we cherish. So visit 5things.com. No, visit my5things.com. Sorry for that. My5things.com to view, they've got wonderful video invitations. Both Adam and Peter have made them for their upcoming classes. And then here, please use the discount code Memoir Nation 10 to save $10 off the ticket price to each class. And now through July 1st, to any 5 Things I've Learned class, including classes by Brooke and me. So Memoir Nation 10 once again, and my5things.com once again, and two great memoirists, Adam Gopnik and Peter Orner. Go. Hello, prose poets, miniaturists, flash writers, and masters of brevity. I'm Grant Faulkner, and I'm here as always with my co-host of 8+ years, Brooke Warner. And today we have a guest I've been super excited about for a while now, Beth Ann Fennelly, because as some of you might know, I've been obsessed with the short form of writing since I discovered 100-word stories nearly 20 years ago. And I ended up starting a lit journal for 100-word stories called 100-Word Story, and then published my own collection of them, Fissures, and wrote a book on the craft of writing the short stuff, The Art of Brevity. And I also just published a flash novel, Something Out There in the Distance. And I mention all of this just so listeners know that how deep I am in the form and how the short form actually influences everything I write these days, even longer pieces. And I'm especially interested in it as it applies to memoir, because I think our lives are essentially lived in flashes. And my current memoir might actually be called a flash memoir because the narration is sort of like a collage or a quilt. I'm stitching tiny stories together into one whole. And I've long heard about the work of Beth Ann Fennelly, who is the former Poet Laureate of Mississippi. And she's the author of 7 books and a writer who has, really furthered this literary form with her last 2 books. And we'll get to all that. But first, Brooke, I want to ask you, what did you feel like reading The Irish Goodbye? What do you think of flash memoir as a form?
Yeah, The Irish Goodbye is extraordinary. I mean, I love that you go from a piece that's about a single sentence and it's often humorous to a longish essay about something that is very serious, and somehow it all hangs together as a complete, deeply felt life. So it's something that all of our listeners should go read. It's a great book, but also to see what are we even talking about when we talk about micro-memoir. Micro-memoir, along with a lot of these other emerging forms in memoir, has really changed my idea about what a memoir can actually be. And I absolutely love that writers are exploring this kind of range in their own work. And Grant, I want to go back to you discovering the 100-word story form because you did discover it as a memoir, not the fictional stories that you wrote later. And so could you talk about that a bit?
Yeah, it was interesting because I very consciously moved from the memoir side of it to the fictional side. And now I'm moving back, I guess. But my good friend Jake Strom's father, Paul Strom, he wrote a memoir of 100-word stories called Sport and Jack. And when I read his pieces, I was just enchanted with the form because, each story was like a little snapshot, and some of them were connected and some of them were just single isolated moments in his life. And I just thought it was the perfect way to tell the story of a life. I like, how the short form, how it allows you to focus on a tiny or ordinary part of life that just might not make it into a more conventional or longer memoir. And I love the kind of collage feeling of little stories and memories and how they created, this just texture of how I actually remember and think about my life. And I liked how Paul's stories, they're like little prose poems. And when I wrote my own, they really did help me bring out more of a poetic slant to everything I write. And I also like them just because writing them taught me so much about writing itself in a different way. Like, for example, I learned what I call the art of omission, which is how to tell a story through what's left out of a story, and how to create a vivid world and suspense by, telling the story by giving the reader hints. So it's not meant to be like a comprehensive story as longer pieces generally are. So for me, this form, it just helps me express the ambiguity of life as well. It's a form that relies on ambiguity. And you might even say that ambiguity is a craft tool of flash fiction. Or flash stories in general, rather.
And it makes me think about subtext too, for people who need to practice subtext, frankly, because a lot of memoirists do show too much or even tell too much. And so the art of boiling it down is powerful, and just a good reason to study this form, even if you're not going to do one, I think. I did want to say the title of Beth Ann's book provides a metaphor for the aesthetic, really. And you do mention this to her, like this Irish goodbye. For those who don't know the phrase, but I think most people do, it's this idea of like leaving a party without saying goodbye to anyone, which is the opposite of the Jewish goodbye or the Italian goodbye, from what I know of my Jewish and Italian friends. And, so the Irish goodbye, you just slip out, and the Irish goodbye creates a fragment of a life or a snapshot or an incomplete story. And so I really love that it's such a great title. And it's also the emotional center of her book. So her sister, Julie, died suddenly in 2008. She thought she had the flu, but it was pneumonia, and there was no goodbye. And yet Beth Ann finds a way to hold that grief in these tiny, precise containers. And it's also a testament to her skill as a writer that grief never overwhelms the book. There's really a lot of humor and so much wit. And one of the shortest pieces in the book, again, that she's going to say aloud, recite in the interview, it's just called Birthday. And the entire piece is "Even my earlobes look old." Grant, I know we both laughed out loud at that. And then 2 pages later, you're in tears.
Definitely. It's I think it's one of the best stories about aging I've ever read. What more do you need to know?
Right.
But yeah, that balance between, the comic and the elegiac, between light and dark, it's just one of the things I most want to ask her about today. In her interview with NPR, she said that the short form allowed her to explore the darker side of life because she knew she wouldn't have to stay in the darkness too long. And I'd never heard someone talk about that being a benefit of the flash form, but it does make sense. And I think the flash form is what makes the balance between lightness and darkness truly possible in a work like this. And, I definitely experienced that with Maggie Smith's memoir, You Could Make This Place Beautiful, for example, where, suddenly there'd just be like a single sentence or a short paragraph on a page. And sometimes it would be blunt drama, but other times it would be playful and funny. So it just allowed that kind of seesawing of emotion. And I'm excited to focus on this now because the memoir writers who come to Memoir Nation, they're not all writing the 300-page narrative of their whole life. A lot of them are writing little snapshots and little pieces. And the question of whether those pieces can add up to something, whether they constitute a memoir and whether the fragment can hold a whole life, that's exactly what Beth Ann's work answers.
Yeah, exactly. And she came to this form somewhat accidentally, similar to you, which is a good thing for listeners to think about, that sometimes it's good to just try on another form or allow the accidental to enter your writing, to make sure that you're open and staying receptive to the unexpected. And also that the thing you're writing might not be the thing you plan to write. Most memoirists discover that when they get into it. And sometimes that's actually good news. In Beth Ann's case, after co-writing a novel with her husband, she sat down expecting another big project. And instead, she found herself writing these little jottings, like funny memories, a bizarre observation, something overheard. And then she looked at the notebook one day and she thought, wait, what is this? And then this is the form. And I know, Grant, you and I have talked about this idea of following form. And I love that she did that.
Yeah, it reminds me of the novel Why Did I Ever by Mary Robeson, which could be called autofiction, I think, or maybe even memoir. But Robeson was having this type of midlife crisis, if I remember right, or maybe it was even a breakdown. And she would just go driving in her car and she'd stop when, she had a noteworthy thought or memory, and she'd write it on a note card. And she actually wrote thousands of these note cards and then arranged 536 of them into what became her novel. And she said they could go in order, and you can kind of feel that when reading her novels. So yeah, I think there's just so many interesting ways to capture your life, or that slice of life that a memoir is, focused on.
Absolutely. Yeah. The short form invites a lot of experimentation, which, like I said, I love. I know you love it, Grant. You live by it. So we are looking forward to talking to Beth Ann after this very short break. So hang with us.
Hello, memoir and writers. I am Grant Faulkner at Memoir Nation, and I'm happy to say that Pro Writing Aid is now sponsoring this podcast. And I'm happy about that because I have used Pro Writing Aid, both as a grammar checker, but more importantly, as a tool to help me structure and probe questions in my book. And the main tool I have used is their manuscript analysis tool. It provides full manuscript developmental feedback in minutes. And to tell you the truth, I was initially dubious of it, but when I used it, it helped me uncover plot holes and think about different structural possibilities and see how my pacing worked. And I liked it because it was kind of like a beta reader, because it opened up questions for me to consider. But I want to emphasize not solutions, just questions. And it made me more aware of some story elements to consider. So I essentially emerged from that analysis with a revision plan in hand. Just so you know, Pro Writing Aid's goal is not to automate storytelling. It's to make the process of writing richer and more empowering by opening up questions to consider your writing. Also, many of Pro Writing Aid's competitors support only one part of the writing process, but Pro Writing Aid has tools to help writers, from the first spark of inspiration to the polished draft. And it really is focused on creative writing, not business writing and stuff like that. So here's the dramatic ending. We have an exclusive discount for you. If you type in memoir, all caps memoir, to the promo code box on the purchase page, you'll get 20% off all annual subscription plans. So I encourage you to type in memoir when you sign up for Pro Writing Aid and get 20% off, and write and revise, write and revise, write and revise. Thank you, Memoir Nation listeners. Hey, everybody. Welcome back. I'm super excited to introduce Beth Ann Fennelly to our podcast today. Beth Ann was Poet Laureate of Mississippi from 2016 to 2021, and she now teaches in the MFA program at the University of Mississippi, where she's a 4-time teaching award winner. She's published 3 poetry books, Open House, Tender Hooks, and Unmentionables, and I'm very curious about the connection between her poetry and her micro-aesthetic and memoir. She's also published a book of nonfiction, Great with Child, and a novel she co-authored with her husband, Tom Franklin, called The Tilted World. Her 6th book, Heating and Cooling, 52 Micro-Memoirs, was named an Atlanta Journal-Constitution Best Book, a Goodreaders Favorite for 2017, and the winner of the Housatonic Book Prize. And her new book is The Irish Goodbye, Micro-Memoirs, and we're going to focus on that today, of course. And Beth Ann lives in Oxford, Mississippi, with her husband, Tom, and their 3 children. Welcome, Beth Ann.
Thank you so much, Grant. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. I'm very excited to speak with you, talk with you. And, we were just talking about your title before you came on, The Irish Goodbye. It's funny. I didn't learn what an Irish goodbye was until 5 years ago or so. And I'm a person who really needs to practice the Irish goodbye because I linger at parties forever and tell good people goodbye several times over before I leave. But we were thinking that it's actually a wonderful metaphor for flash writing because it's a fragment itself, or it speaks to the fragmentary. There's only a whisper of an ending or a complete silence, a disappearance. So an Irish goodbye just holds a mystery naturally, or a sense of incompletion. But it's more than just a metaphor for a form of writing. So I was wondering if you could tell us why you decided to title this book The Irish Goodbye, and just kind of how it gathers these stories or these essays together.
Sure. There's a small piece in the book. I would say it's one of the one-sentence pieces, but actually it's a fragment. And it goes like this. The Irish Goodbye. How, without warning, you slipped out of the party of your life, oh, my sister. One of the threads that weaves through the book is the sudden death of my sister in 2008. And another thread that weaves through the book is the very long and excruciating death of my mother. Just in November, she died of Alzheimer's, and it was a very long and very miserable and very, very sad death. So there's a lot of light in the book and a lot of humor, but those two threads do come back again and again. So when I was thinking of a title for the book, I was looking back at titles of individual pieces because, of course, there's many people who title a book after like the most significant piece, you know, the novella in the collection of stories or whatever. And then I saw that one little piece and I thought, I kind of like that it's a fragment and like an Irish goodbye slipping out the door before the party's over, but also my sister dying so unexpectedly in the middle of the night with no knowledge or warning. And also that the micro-memoir is a form that is almost over before you know it. And you have to be paying attention because it slips right out the door. So those were kind of some of the things that were going through my head as I decided on the title.
That's so fascinating. And I love this description of micro-memoir. And I think more people are wanting to do micro-memoir. And it really is a true hybrid in the sense that it combines the compression of poetry, the narrative tension of fiction, and then the truth-telling of creative nonfiction. But for someone listening who has never read a micro-memoir, how would you describe what it does that a regular essay or conventional memoir chapter perhaps can't?
Well, thanks, Brooke, for that good question. I do know a lot of people who are interested in the fragment, like Claudia Rankine and Maggie Nelson, and I love their work, but I myself am not interested in working in the fragment. I'm interested in seeing how compressed I can make a narrative and have it have as much impact as possible per word. My spirit animal is the hummingbird, which you might know, the ruby-throated hummingbird, is so lightweight. You could mail 7 of them in an envelope for a regular first-class stamp. Yet it can fly 500 miles over the Gulf of Mexico to migrate to Central America and then return in the spring. 500 miles without stopping, this little tiny bird. I live in Mississippi and the hummingbirds come here a lot because we're on their migratory route. And so I have looked to them as a metaphor for what I'm trying to do with my project, which isn't a fragment. It's condensing and compacting and having a big lyrical thrust that hopefully comes from that incredible compaction.
Cool. Well, sorry, can I just, for the sake of like the thoroughness of it, like if somebody sat down to write micro-memoir and they didn't have experience with poetry, where do you think that, like, what would be something you would say, well, it's different from a chapter that you're writing because of this? I mean, I understand what you're saying about the condensing, but would you just say like they should study poetry?
I think that they should study everything. I mean, in other words, it's a hybrid form. Like it has more than one literary parents. And so I came to this through this very circuitous route of loving poetry and studying nothing but poetry and then falling in love with a sentence and leaving the line break behind and seeing how much like juice I could extract from the sentence and just crushing so hard on these like narrative possibilities. And then wanting to bring in, fidelity to the truth, even the way like a poet might have fidelity to the sonnet where you're going to be working in iambic and you're going to have a rhyme pattern, like only working the realm of fact got incredibly interesting to me. I started writing these pieces right around the 2016 presidential election and thinking about, is it even possible to have a true fact? What does that mean? So it was a combination of these various things and these crazy things that I was reading. I love haiku, especially the haiku of Isa, who is a very funny haiku writer. People don't know that you can be funny in that form. The short stories of Lydia Davis, the extreme compression of some of Stuart Dybek's short stories, The Pillow Book, which was written by Sei Shonagon over 1,000 years ago about a Japanese lady in waiting to the Empress of Japan. All these crazy things that I've just been reading and loving and not even knowing how to categorize and not worrying about categorizing really were part of what formed the background for me to start writing in this very strange but very fun and user-friendly form.
Yeah. I think Flash has always kind of struggled to be categorized, and that's one of its beauties. And I think a lot of people come to it through poetry, even if they're not poets. Like I wasn't a poet. I'm kind of more of a frustrated poet. And Flash allows me to feel more poetry in my writing, I think, and to capture that essence that you mentioned. My next question kind of goes in that direction. One of the things I find so powerful about the Irish Goodbye is the range of emotional registers, like as you mentioned, you'll have one essay be a single sentence and it's purely comic, and then there might be a 17-page essay that's very devastating or very revealing and vulnerable. And so I'm very curious about the length of a piece and how does that tell you something about the emotion it's holding? Like, is there a relationship between size and feeling, or can you capture it all in that little tiny sentence?
Yeah, I did privilege extreme tonal register in the book. So I think we turn to books to have a lot of feelings, and we're living in a world that doesn't really encourage us to have a lot of feelings, or only feelings that go in certain areas. And I was interested in writing a book that allowed the reader to experience as many different emotions as possible. And then there's a lot of variety, not just in tone, but in length. So the shortest piece is 5 words. And then some of the pieces are yours, almost like essay length memoirs that, one is 15 pages, for example. It's not that I've kind of ghettoized the short ones into being funny, or to, I already read you The Irish Goodbye. The title one is very sad, but the shortest one, at 5 words, birthday, even my earlobes look old. So, some of they register in tone too. The longer pieces, the only difference between some of the longer essays is they have a bit more room for reflection. And so sometimes there's a more retrospective or nostalgic or meditative air that you almost don't really have time for in a piece that's 1 sentence long.
Thanks for that, Beth Ann. A lot of our listeners are working on memoirs, and, traditional narrative-driven memoirs are usually the case. And so what would you say to a memoirist who's drawn to the flash form, but then worried that short pieces won't be able to do justice to the big things, the grief, the trauma, the complexity, or even, how you just beautifully articulated aging in 5 words?
Yeah, I think that there's nothing that you can't write about in flash, but I think sometimes you have to think about narrowing the aperture, which is to say, for example, if I asked you right now to write an essay about the hardest phone call you've ever had to make, you would probably need a lot of real estate. You have to do a lot of backstory there to explain why this relationship was complicated and how the phone call took place and what it was and the aftershocks, right? I have a piece in The Irish Goodbye about an accidental phone call I made where I called the wrong person, but she actually told me exactly what I needed to know in a way that helped my heart. So sometimes it's about finding the right size idea to succeed in flash, or coming at a big idea from an oblique angle, coming at it, sideways really, as opposed to hitting the big topic from the most traditional way. So I think flash, one thing that it can do is illuminate the moments of our lives and how a moment can actually incorporate a universe.
Well, Beth Ann, there's one piece in the book I really have been dying to talk to you about, because I think it's really a kind of classic essay that everyone should read. And it's the piece where your editor asks you to reveal how your sister died, and you push back. And the title of it is Because My Editor Suggests I Reveal How My Sister Died. So it starts with this kind of at this meta level. But there's so many more interesting layers beneath that, how you start to tell the story through your sister's autopsy and just your hesitation and your reluctance to tell the story. But then your comments kind of seep into things. And there's so many interesting things, like the fact that she Googled flu symptoms on her last night, or that you thought that her death was 13% suicide because of her lifestyle. You just feel so many different angles of this piece. And so I'm so curious about it because of these tensions involved in it, and how you convey so much in just 3 pages, even though you wrote with reluctance and hesitation. So I was wondering if you could just tell us more about that piece and more about your editor's request, and just what this piece also says about what a writer might owe a reader and how you realize that.
Yeah, that's a great question, Grant. I did finish the manuscript and turn it into my editor, who is Jill Bialowski at Norton. And we've worked together for several books now, and I think she's great and I trust her. The book was done, full stop. Here's the book, and she told me it wasn't done, that I needed to write about my sister's death. And I didn't like that at all, because I knew she was right. I 100% knew she was right. And that's why I was like, no, I don't think so. So what I had done was I had written a lot about grieving my sister in the previous book of Micro-Memoirs, Heating and Cooling, and then in this book. Interestingly, I had never written about my sister before, even though she died in 2008. I'd never written about her in poems or a novel or longer essays. It's almost like something about the flash form, it being so small, let me finally enter this horrible territory because I knew I could go in and get out in a paragraph or a page. Something about it being flash, like almost gave me access to these emotions that I was scared to tackle in anything longer because I literally could not go to the dark place and stay there. So I'd written about grieving my sister, which I thought I would never be able to do, but I'd never said how she died because I couldn't. It was too painful. And then my editor told me I had to. And the reason why I knew she was right is because when I wrote about grieving her, I was like pointing a finger at my sister's death, but withholding the answer. And I was causing people to be curious about it. And I knew this was the case because one time I was giving a reading someplace and I didn't have with me what I wanted at the last minute to read. So I Googled myself. And when you Google yourself or anybody, there comes a box on the screen that tells you other things people have searched for. And that box is called related searches. So I look at the box related searches and it says Beth Ann Fennelly, Micro-Memoirs, Beth Ann Fennelly, poems, Beth Ann Fennelly, TED Talk, Beth Ann Fennelly, University of Mississippi. And then it said Beth Ann Fennelly's sister. So I knew people had been Googling my sister to try to find out how she died. And so by calling attention and writing about my sister's death, but not giving people this thing, I had made them prurient. Like I'd force them to like do their own digging and do like this ugly thing of Googling this, as opposed to just telling them what they wanted to know. And I don't think it was weird that they wanted to know that. I think I kept like directing them back to it and then frustrating their curiosities. And so I sent them to Google, which is horrible. So I knew she was right. And I knew I had to write that piece, but I was angry also, frankly, that I had to write it. And that's that tone you sense. And so I just ripped off the Band-Aid the fastest way I could think of, which was quoting from the autopsy. Like, how much more direct can you be to say what someone's death is? But even now, I still don't understand her death completely. So I had to acknowledge that in the piece as well.
Thank you, Beth Ann. My gosh, I really appreciate that. Also, just as an editor, I think I'm constantly probing people to write things that they don't want to write. It's sort of a job description. And so it's interesting to hear about it from the other side. And it's a good segue to my next question, which is about shame. You grew up Irish Catholic, and you said that your upbringing was all shame and secrets for everybody, and you simply did not talk about anything ugly. And so as a result, you push into shame as an adult. Now you're 54 and you've said you're not interested in holding anything back. I love that. It's also very difficult to write about shame. And, you're talking about any difficult subject, whether it's grief or just not understanding, but specific to shame. Can you talk about how you do it? I mean, not like from a craft perspective, but I think from an emotional perspective. And do you think that your age has affected your ability to go there?
Yeah, absolutely. So, as a child, I was taught, you would never want to be vulnerable. You would always protect yourself and hide any negative emotion you had or anything that you had done that was bad. And now we live in this society of, Facebook and Instagram, where everyone is curating their lifestyle and photoshopping their appearance, and their vacation is better than your vacation, and their kids are prettier than your kids. And, we're throwing out these false versions of ourselves in a way that has made us lose touch actually with the human part of being a human, which is foibles and flaws and, messy experiences and emotions that we don't quite understand. And as I've gotten older, I've gotten less interested in protecting myself or trying to look good or projecting a false sense. I actually think the project of understanding who we are as humans is maybe the goal of being on Earth. So why would I look away from something? And I'm attracted, in fact, now to pressing into an area of shame simply because I know there's something about that experience I'm called to understand. And through writing about it, I might understand it better and then understand myself better and hopefully all people better as a result.
You write about an essay, and it's another one of your classic essays in my mind, about nude modeling, and especially nude modeling in this relatively small town. And I grew up in a small town. So yeah, if you model nude, it's well known throughout the town and everyone wants to see it. And I've actually always been fascinated by nude modeling myself, but never done it. So I thought your whole entree into it was very fascinating. And you write, perhaps when vulnerability is a burden shared by all, it ceases to be a burden. Perhaps it becomes a gift. And I think that that's our ultimate quest in writing, is to make our vulnerability a gift and to put it out there. And I taught a class once on writing with vulnerability, and I don't think I did it well. I'm still thinking about that class and trying to figure out how to help people write about their vulnerability, how to go there. And so I was just wondering if you can talk about that at all, both as a writing teacher and someone who is writing to this subject matter.
I agree with you. I mean, I think that is really our goal. And to help students achieve that, to be able to look at their lives and be vulnerable about who they are, I think would be a great gift to give them, and actually, help them maybe live more fulfilled lives as writers and humans. That piece did surprise me. And frankly, I was surprised that I did that shocking thing. I'd never thought I would do something like pose nude. That well-known West Coast artist, his name is Robert Townsend, came to our town. He was interested in working in this little town of Oxford, Mississippi, and asked for volunteers. And there was, at no point was I ever going to do that. But I began to get to know him and really admire his artwork, began to really admire and trust him as a person. And then I watched a documentary that had been made about his artwork. And there are all these things making me feel called to do this thing that I was scared to do, this thing that I didn't think I could do. And part of it was about the experience of having a middle-aged body and being told that middle-aged women are to be looked through, and deciding that I was going to be bigger than life in this portrait, 7 feet tall, framed in fluorescent pink. And also, it's not about the beauty industry. It was not about looking sexy. It was the opposite. It's like literally the least sexy thing I've done in my life. You're standing with your hands at your sides. You're not trying to strike any seductive pose or, it was like a super plain, and it's about recognizing each other's humanity. That's Rob's goal, is to increase empathy between the viewer and the painting in a way that helps us recognize our own humanity. So there were several reasons why I ended up agreeing to do it, but I still didn't think I'd write about it. I just thought I would do it, and it was a one-off and no one would know. So I'm the idiot that ended up writing about it. So now everyone knows I did it. It was horrible to publicize something that you're ashamed of. But in truth, I was interested in why I did it, because I had to think through, why would I do this thing that shocked me? And I wanted to understand better my own motivation, because I felt that doing it was a way of becoming more myself and accepting myself and my flaws. So I wrote the essay, and now I fear that everyone's going to know I did this horrible thing.
I also think I've heard this from, other women, and I'll say our age, because I'm right there with you. And I do think it's empowering, and it's great to write about it. It's great to read about. And I wanted to ask you another closing question about one of your pieces, because when I first read this essayette, we'll call it that, in the book that was about your husband and his folding over of the oven mitts, I was prepared for it to be a story of grief or betrayal or a marriage gone wrong. But in fact, it's the opposite. It's a celebration of a couple's quirky, playful relationship. And you celebrate marital love so often in this book. And it reminded me of Bob Hickok's love poems about his wife. And it's such a rare subject to encounter in literature. And so I just would like to close with you saying a bit about this theme and how you combine that, in a book that is also about grief for your mother and your sister.
Yeah. So I am interested in exploring lesser explored emotions. So, shame is one that we were talking about earlier, that, a lot of people shy away from anything that makes them look bad. But the love of people who've been hanging out for a long time is also not really celebrated in our culture. We have an ethos that looks at first love or unrequited love, but that like day-to-dayness of a long relationship, it's not really represented, because it seems like it's not dramatic or there's nothing to be looked at. And I actually think that there's a lot of humor and wryness and affection that comes out in something like a long joke that you can only have crop up in a marriage. So in this particular situation that I write about in that piece, my husband and I had been playing categories, and he wrote, for the category was things you fold, and the letter was O, and he wrote oven mitts. And we had an argument. I refused him his point. I'm like, nobody folds oven mitts, So now he's folded them ever since. And it has been years. And if you were in my drawer right now in Oxford, Mississippi, and you open the drawer beside the stove, you would find the oven mitts folded, and you always will. That's just that kind of thing happens. But I was interested in writing about this aspect of a long marriage. And I also liked the ways these pieces tend to be a little bit lighter and balance out some of the harder work that's being done and some of the more, somber or difficult pieces in the book. And this is also a series, the Married Love series, that continues in my earlier book, Heating and Cooling. It's a thread that weaves through. So while I was saying earlier, I want each piece to stand individually, and I do, I also like the idea that someone who's read my whole book beginning to end, or even the previous book and this book, will begin to have a little bit of that novelistic richness where you come to a character at one point and then you return to them at another point, or you see people recur or ideas recur in a way that gives a little bit of that fullness of experience where it's not just a one and done.
And then I have to say that scene, as you were talking, I thought about how that was so perfect for the Flash form, how something like folding up oven mitts, that kind of joke, that anecdote, oftentimes wouldn't fit into a larger conventional narration, So anyway, it captured it perfectly. And just that moment, I saw my own marriage right in that moment as well. So
That's awesome.
Thank you so much for being with us and talking about your new book.
Oh my goodness. Thank you guys so much. I'm a fan of Memoir Nation. I love what you guys are doing. So thank you for having me on the show.
No, congratulations, Beth Ann, and thank you. We'll be right back with today's book trend.
Okay, I want to share something we've been thinking about lately that feels genuinely useful for anyone who has a book out or is getting ready to launch one. And it's about book publicity and specifically about a shift that's been happening. And strangely enough, I don't know why I didn't think of this earlier, but it just occurred to me recently. And it came out of frustration that my new book, Something Out There in the Distance, hasn't gotten many reviews. And to tell you the truth, I don't even really know where to go to get reviews. There are a few standard places, but some of the other places just don't seem worth the effort to me. But, this traditional model of book publicity, kind of hangs over my head or hangs over many people's head. And that's because it's been built around book reviews and the idea that book reviews drive attention and sales. And definitely that still matters, I think. But the honest truth is that there are fewer and fewer places publishing book reviews than there were even 10 years ago. And they're just less influential, than they used to be. Newspapers have cut their book sections. Magazines have reduced their literary coverage. Just the ecosystem has shrunk a great deal. So here was my realization, a few months into my own book being out, is that, I'd been overlooking something that was right in front of me the whole time, which is Substack. I've invested a lot in my own Substack, but I've also connected with a lot of people on Substack. And I think like a thoughtful piece about a book and a well-read Substack newsletter, it reaches a lot of people sometimes. And, sometimes those readers are more engaged readers than of a book review in a traditional newspaper.
Yeah, I think what you're saying definitely makes sense. Substack as a tool of publicity is right there because you're reaching your readers and you're the person that they're trusting if they're subscribing to you, and especially if they're a paid subscriber. And then when somebody reads a newsletter, they're essentially saying like, I really love what you write. And so then it's like, it's a natural, bridge to, of course, promoting your book. So I love this idea. And I know we talked about it a little bit, Grant, when we talked about Lena Dunham, who was doing like her entire Substack publicity tour. Mm-hmm. And so, I think that people also recommending books on Substack, which I see all the time, by the way. And it really is the difference between, like a billboard, which is kind of standard traditional media right now, and a friend telling you something directly. So this concept of Substack publicity or Substack book tour, I think, is like really of the moment. Like you're reaching newsletter authors whose audiences overlap with your readership. You can ask for people to feature your book. And so I think this is great. And I also think it's not too late for your book.
Thank you. Because that's the weird thing about book reviews is that book review editors, just like bookstore owners, they have their rules, that you want to get that review out, before the book comes out or right when the book comes out, very within a kind of narrow time frame, which is difficult for the indie author to do all that, to do all that outreach. And I have a publicist, but it's just a harder game these days. And so that's what I like about the idea of also doing a Substack book tour, is that no one is making these like hard and fast rules. The book has a longer life than just its first 3 months. And so, I like to think that when I have a plan to reach out to Substack newsletters, and I hope that they'll be open to it. They won't ask the date of when the book came out. It will be relevant.
They don't care.
They don't care. It's just a book in the world, and a book in the world to tell people about, hopefully. So so people know what my plan is, I'm going to make a list of, hopefully 20 or so Substacks in my genre. Again, like writers I know and have interacted with, and who I hope will help me out. And also, if they don't, that's also fine. And I'm going to think about my newsletter in this way too, of how I can promote people's books more than I do right now. And once again, thinking also, like, I think true fans are more important than a mass number of potential fans. And so I'm looking, a newsletter with 5,000 highly engaged readers is, more important than a newsletter with 50,000 readers who might care less about my book or the genre it's in.
Yeah. And that has always been true. It's just like Substack gives us much more direct connection to our readers. And Grant, this is a good time to announce that we are inside our Memoir Nation community, asking people to tell us about their publications so that we can start featuring those on Memoir Nation, both on the podcast and in our newsletter. And so that's going to become a regular feature. There are many, many ways to promote writers. And so when you say you're looking to do that, I just want to say we are going to do that for sure, also with Memoir Nation. And I always tell my authors that it's fine to stagger your outreach, especially when it comes to Substack. So like a book tour, to your point, like it doesn't have to be all immediate. And I love the idea that it would be more like a drumbeat of attention over time and not everything hitting all at once, because it's just as ridiculous, this notion that we're supposed to like go out and get publicity for our books for like a 1 month period right following publication, and then it tapers off. And so if you can, kind of parse it out a little bit, you're also going to keep the conversation going. And then you continually post your pieces on social media and keep the conversation alive. And so there's just all these touch points. And I think that Substack is a natural environment for that.
Yeah, completely. And I want to make one final recommendation is to, again, engage genuinely with the newsletters you're approaching before you ask for anything. Leave comments, share their work, be a real reader, not just a person with a book to promote. Substack definitely operates as a community, and the community runs on reciprocity, of course. And one of the big takeaways for me, though, is to really think about how the gatekeepers have changed. A thoughtful Substack writer with a devoted readership is, for many books and many audiences, more powerful than a traditional review outlet. If you're not thinking about Substack as part of your book publicity strategy, I think you're leaving something real on the table. And just one more tip. On my own Substack, I did a Substack live, and it was essentially a reading and a discussion of my book, and it was super fun, and people actually showed up. I did a happy hour on Friday, and it was great. It was just so different, such a different way to promote a book. And I can't believe I wasn't doing this earlier, but now that I'm doing it, I want to advise other people to try it out as well.
Awesome. Yes, everybody, go find your people. If the gates have fallen on your book, you can think about other ways to open them. Substack, definitely. And, it's also a great thing about the age that we're living in. There's so much doom. I participate in it. It's very difficult not to.
I laugh. But you say there's so much doom, and I laugh.
I know, but it's so true. Like almost all of our trends are negative, right? But this one is like a leveling of the playing field, and we don't have to play by the usual rules, and you can create your own rules. And that is a hugely positive trend. And this is really what we are wanting for Memoir Nation to be too, a place where you can create your own rules, find your people, find your community. So don't forget that we have a community. When you go to memoirnation.com, click on the community button. It is free. We will invite you to come in and check out all the things that we have going on. And then, of course, our podcast every week. So we'll see you next week, and we thank you for listening.